Jim and I had just finished our day's shift at the plant, and we were driving back home together in my car. We always commuted together whenever our work shifts coincided, and this week it was my turn to use my car. As soon as we left the plant, Jim asked me to stop at a pharmacy on our way back home so that he could have a prescription filled. His wife, Sally, had a bad cold, and the doctor had prescribed medication to help her get rid of her stubborn cold. Since we were passing by the pharmacy where my wife, Rachel, was working, I decided to surprise both Jim and my wife by stopping there. Throughout all those years she had been working there, I had never once visited her at her place of work. I figured she would be very surprised to see me there today. I had never dared to visit her at the pharmacy because I didn't want her coworkers or her boss to think I was checking on her. Surprisingly, she had never commented on this fact to me. She was working that day, and I knew she would be indeed surprised to see me. She only worked there 2 days a week, and I thought it was about time I met her boss after 6 years of marriage. Rachel and I had been married for 9 years, and even though we weren't rich, I was earning good money at the plant where I worked. I preferred that my wife stay at home, but 2 years after our marriage, she claimed she needed to get out of the house and wanted to enter the workforce. She also wished to have a car of her own. She convinced me to let her work for a year or two, at least until she had saved enough to buy the car she wanted. A week after we agreed, she found a job at a pharmacy on the other side of town. Just over a year later, she gave birth to Sandy. For the next 2 years, she became a stay-at-home mom. Later, when Sandy was older, she once again begged me to let her work, even if it was only a couple of days a week. She claimed she had already contacted the pharmacy where she had previously worked, and Mr. Clarkson was willing to take her back, even if it was just for 2 days a week. I finally agreed, and she arranged for her mother to take care of Sandy on those days. She had now been working 2 days a week for Mr. Clarkson for over 3 years, and Sandy was almost 6 years old. Not once had I stepped inside her place of work. I parked in front of the pharmacy, and Jim and I both went inside. It wasn't a huge place, but it had just about everything one would expect to find in a pharmacy. There were 4 long aisles, on each side of which were shelves loaded with everything from cough syrup to all brands of medicines. Then, completely at the back, was the space where prescriptions were being filled. Of course, Jim and I immediately walked there, but instead of seeing Rachel as I expected, there was only a middle-aged man behind the long counter. He took Jim's prescription and started working on it. I was about to introduce myself and ask him where my wife was, but since Jim was standing next to me, I didn't want him to know that I was ignorant about the fact she was not there. So I didn't say anything while the pharmacist was busy filling the prescription. Jim slowly wandered further away, looking around at the different displays. That's when I decided to give a closer inspection to the back of the place. As soon as I looked over the counter behind the pharmacist, my eyes fell on a desk near the wall. On it rested a framed picture of a girl who appeared to be about 7 or 8. The thing that struck me about the picture was the fact that the child and it looked so much like my Sandy that it was uncanny. She had the same long blonde hair and blue eyes, even her smile was the same. I just stood there all as I examined the picture. I was shocked and amazed by the resemblance to my daughter. It was as if I was looking at how Sandy would look in a year or so. How was that possible? I asked myself all of a sudden. I couldn't help myself, and I asked the pharmacist, who was still busy counting pills, if the child in the picture was his daughter. No, I have only 2 boys at home. This is Kathy. She is the daughter of Mr. Clarkson. She is a lovely child, isn't she? Yes, she certainly is, I replied. I was simply too shocked to say anything, so I moved away, pretending to look for an item on the shelf on my left. But deep inside, I suddenly felt sick. I kept asking myself, how could this Kathy look so much like my own daughter, and where was my wife? Then I had a very bad feeling deep inside. I suppose that I had a hint of a clue to the answers to both questions, but I wasn't ready to admit it to myself. All of a sudden, I felt a strong need to get out of there. I walked toward Jim and told him I was going to wait for him in the car. While sitting there waiting for Jim, I began to think. Sandy looked nothing like Rachel, and she certainly had none of my facial features. Also, Rachel and I both had brown eyes and dark brown hair, while Sandy was blonde. When she was a young child, all my friends kept making jokes about the color of her hair. Jim even asked me if I was ordering pizza often at my house or what the hair color of the mailman was. Of course, these were only friendly jokes, and I didn't let these remarks bother me. But now it all came back to haunt me. Was Sandy really my daughter, or was she the daughter of Mr. Clarkson? The strange thing was that I had never once met or seen Carl Clarkson, so I didn't have a clue as to what he looked like, except for the fact that he had light, colored hair. Rachel had mentioned this to me a few times. When Rachel and I were home later that evening, she noticed my quiet and pensive mood. She even asked me if there was something bothering me. Of course, I didn't tell her that I had stopped at her place of work that day or what was on my mind. But I certainly would have liked to learn where she was when I stopped there. Still, I kept my mouth shut about my doubts. I knew I had to be careful and not accuse her of something that might exist only in my imagination. More importantly, I knew that I needed to get proof to confirm or disprove my doubts about the parentage of my daughter. You see, it was extremely painful for me to even consider the possibility that my precious angel might not be my biological daughter. I loved my daughter more than anyone else in the world, and I would have walked through fire for her. I tried to convince myself that it was probably just a coincidence that the two girls looked so much alike, but deep inside, I experienced growing suspicion that kept coming to the surface. Later that night, while I was in bed lying next to my wife, the full impact of the day's events finally hit me. If Sandy wasn't my daughter, and if Carl Clarkson was her biological father, this implied that Rachel had been deceiving me from the very beginning when she first began working for him over 6 years earlier. I told myself that even today, it was more than probable she was still continuing her affair with her lover. She had probably made a fool of me during all those years, each time she returned home to me after having been with her boss. She was probably secretly enjoying the knowledge that she had just fooled me, knowing I suspected nothing of her affair. Yes, I had already noticed that she always took a shower as soon as she came home, saying to me, "I have to remove the smell of the different chemicals I am in contact with." I now knew that she was rushing into the showers as soon as she came home to remove all traces of her recent infidelity. The following day was Friday. Since Rachel wasn't working that day, I drove to her place of work after dropping Jim off at his house. I now wanted to see Carl Clarkson face to face. Since he didn't know me and I had never seen him before, I felt that it was time I finally had a look at him. After asking the woman behind the cash register where Mr. Clarkson was, I was told that he had already gone home, but she added that Mr. Mann, his assistant, could help me with my prescription. She pointed toward the back, indicating the same man who had filled Jim's prescription the previous day. I told her that I would come back on another day since I had personal business with Mr. Clarkson. She then dropped a bombshell on me by adding that I should make sure that I didn't come on a Tuesday or a Thursday afternoon since he was never in the pharmacy at those times. Of course, I left without saying another word. I just nodded to indicate that I understood. What the hell was going on here? I asked myself as soon as I was sitting in my car. Rachel had been hired to assist Mr. Clarkson on those 2 days. She was there to count pills for him and to help him with the filling of prescriptions. At home, she always referred to him as Mr. Clarkson. And now I had just been told that on those 2 days of the week that she was working, he was taking the afternoon off. It just didn't make sense to me. What was Rachel doing on those afternoons? After all, she was supposed to be helping her boss. The previous afternoon, she was not there, but she was supposed to be working. Was she somewhere else with him? After the birth of Sandy, I had been completely against her going back to work, but she kept insisting that she wanted this until I finally conceded. Now I had a very sour feeling about her job, and that child's picture that stood on the desk kept coming back into my mind to haunt me. In my mind, the wall of doubt about my wife's faithfulness was getting stronger all the time. Was she cheating on me with her boss, or was it only my overactive mind playing tricks on me? I discovered that the weekend at home with Rachel was the worst weekend of my life. Every time I would look at her, I kept imagining her having an affair with her boss. Of course, I couldn't place a face on him since I didn't know what he looked like exactly. Up inside, I felt that there was a good chance that Sandy was his daughter. Was he still seeing my wife behind my back? Could she even be working on her second child with him? All those years she had been seeing him, probably more often than I had. I now couldn't think of her without feeling my anger coming to the surface. I knew that from now on, each time I would look at her, I was going to experience the same frustration until I got proof to the contrary. One sad morning, while she was still sleeping next to me, I quietly looked at her. She was a beautiful woman indeed, but the thought of what she was probably doing behind my back discouraged me. We didn't talk at all until noon that day, and when the three of us were sitting around the table, I mostly talked to my daughter. In bed that night, I woke her in the middle of the night to make love. There was no kissing and no soft words, just straightforward intimacy. It was my way to seek revenge on her for giving to another man what was rightfully mine. Only for some reason, Rachel never complained about the way I was treating her. That fact all by itself was telling me more than anything else. She had something to hide and was trying to buy herself out of trouble by allowing me to have all the intimacy I wanted with her. After all, I had no tangible proof yet that she had been cheating. I didn't even understand myself why I was acting this way. All I knew was that I had that strong urge to cause her pain. I suppose that her lack of protest for my treatment was mostly due to fear. But why should she fear me, her husband, unless of course she had something to hide? She just wanted my anger to be over with so that we could go on with our usual daily affairs at home. I could tell she was afraid of getting into a discussion with me, afraid to uncover that I knew her dark secret. She was buying peace by being submissive to me and enduring all the humiliation I was imposing on her. As the days went on, I became still more convinced that she was having an affair with her boss. I was now also convinced that her affair with her boss had been going on for years. All my life, I have always been a gentle and caring husband. I considered myself a good lover to my wife. Now, I was simply using her body to satisfy my needs without any consideration for hers. I didn't feel bad about what I was doing to her since I no longer considered her as my loving wife. I suppose it all boiled down to the fact that I was trying to get a little payback from her by being selfish and rough when making love to her. The more this went on, the more I detected apprehension and fear in her expression. One evening, as she quietly sat in front of me around the kitchen table, I watched her as she quietly ate. I could tell that she suspected that I knew something about her affair with this Carl. She was now probably afraid to bring the matter into the open and have a frank discussion with me. Why was she afraid? I didn't know, since I have never been a violent man. Could it be that she wasn't ready to break up her marriage with me? She wanted to retain the security of being married to me, as well as the excitement. Or was it the love of her affair with her boss? I finally decided to gather proof of her cheating. I made up my mind that I was going to take the day off on the following Tuesday and follow her to her place of work. I was pretty certain that she and her lover weren't engaging in their affair at the pharmacy, so they had to go somewhere else to deceive me. I thus planned to ask Jim to lend me his truck on that day so that I could follow her without being observed. Tuesday morning, I dressed in my working clothes just like usual. Then I drove to pick Jim up at his house. Once there, I gave him the key to my car and I took off in his truck. I drove back to my house, parking the truck just a few houses away from home so that I could see my house easily. Half an hour later, I saw Rachel getting into her car with Sandy, and I discreetly followed her to Sandy's school, where my daughter got off. She then drove directly to the pharmacy. I parked Jim's truck on the other side of the street and waited patiently while listening to the radio. I don't know exactly what I was expecting would happen, but I just knew that something would. From where I was, I could see her red Toyota and most of the parking spaces next to the pharmacy. I was determined to stay there all day if need be. Barely half an hour after she had entered the pharmacy, I saw a black SUV driving into the parking lot, and the driver parked in the space next to my wife's Toyota. A tall, well-dressed man of around 35 got out of the vehicle and entered the pharmacy using his key on a private door that opened next to the parking lot. The moment I saw him getting out of his car, I knew he was the father of the little girl I had seen in the framed picture. It suddenly hit me, this man was probably also the biological father of Sandy. This was my wife's lover. He was the one who had been fooling me for the last 6 years. I felt a strong urge to run after him and beat the hell out of him, then go inside and beat the hell out of my wife also. But the time for expressing my rage that way had passed and gone. I was at least 6 years too late. It would have been fine to do this after she had played him the first or second time. Even then, maybe just maybe, there could have been a chance my marriage could have survived her cheating. But not after 6 years of playing him at a possible rate of 2 times each week. Now was the time to get rid of her as well as to make both of them pay for what they had done to me. Payback was definitely on my mind now. I waited patiently in Jim's truck until noon. All of a sudden, I saw the same door swing open and Rachel and the man got out of the building. They both had smiles on their faces. To someone not knowing them, they looked like a happy couple. They both got into his SUV and they drove away. The black SUV was easy to follow since my wife's lover seemed in no hurry. 15 minutes later, they were driving on a country road that led toward the lake. After 10 minutes, and I watched them turning into the entrance of a nice log cottage right on the shore of the lake, I parked Jim's truck on the side of the road half a mile further, then I walked back toward the log cottage. A tall, well-trimmed cedar hedge, except for the side facing the lake, surrounded it. I thus knew that I had nothing to fear from being observed by the neighbors, since the tall hedge would give me plenty of privacy. I slowly walked around the house until I heard noises coming from an open window on the left side of the cottage. After carefully approaching the half-open window, which came to the height of my shoulders, I looked inside. It took my eyes a couple of seconds to adjust to the half. Darkness in the room, but after a while, I could clearly see the shapes of a woman and that of a man on a bed. They were both naked and already enjoying themselves. Even carefully at his face, I could now detect the resemblance with Sandy, my daughter. He had the same delicate nose that she had, and of course, the same hair and eye color. There were no longer any doubts in my mind now. Carl Clarkson was the biological father of Sandy. He had conceived her with my supposedly faithful wife. All those years, she led me to believe that I was Sandy's father and thus making a fool out of me. My wife and her lover must have been laughing at me. In their eyes, I was the biggest fool there could be, since I was unknowingly raising the child of another man. For all that I knew, they were probably working on another child right now. But I loved my daughter in my mind. She was still my daughter and would always be. No one was going to take her away from me, but it was still an enormous shock to watch my wife making love with another man. This is certainly not something that I would recommend to any husband. It made me extremely angry and sad, even if it did turn me on somewhat at the same time. I was at a loss as to what to do next. By now, I was crying and feeling sorry for myself. Of course, this further served to feed my anger toward both of them. At that moment, I regretted the fact that I hadn't brought a camera with me and thus had access to proof of her cheating. By now, I knew that I was going to file for divorce. I needed convincing arguments of her cheating in front of the judge and to try and get custody of Sandy. Seeing your wife, the woman that you love, secretly having an affair with another man is a devastating experience. I could no longer endure to watch them or listen to what they were saying, so I quietly walked back to the truck. Rachel came home at her usual time after work that day. She immediately went upstairs to take a shower while I finished preparing supper for the family, just like I usually did on those days she was working. We didn't talk much to one another, but we both paid much attention to Sandy, who was telling us all about her day at school. The following morning was a Wednesday, and Rachel wasn't working that day. She was in her gown and sitting at the table eating breakfast with Sandy and me. Once in a while, I caught her looking at me when she thought I was busy eating. She had a strange expression on her face. I suppose that she now strongly suspected that I knew something about her affair with her boss. I could even detect a hint of fear in her look. That evening, while she was putting away the dishes in the kitchen, I told her about a fictitious worker at the plant. He had surprised his wife with another man the previous week. I told her that he had beaten her to within an inch of her life when he discovered her affair. I also added that his friends at the plant were planning to give a lesson to her lover. After quietly listening to what I said, she looked at me with wide eyes. Then she asked me if I thought this was the right thing to do. I explained to her that the woman had no business cheating on her husband. It was only fair that they both, the wife and her lover, should pay for the disrespect that they had shown toward the husband's marriage. Tuesday again, I took the afternoon off and I borrowed Jim's truck once more. After eating my lunch in the truck at noon, I drove to the cottage by the lake, and sure enough, Carl's black SUV was there parked in the driveway. This time I had my video camera with me, and I was prepared to film the proof of their cheating. I needed the proof not only to help me get custody of Sandy, but also to show to Carl's wife. Yes, it was my intention to hurt him as much as I could. He was going to pay for the illicit excitement he got out of his affair with my wife. For a while, I had seriously thought about having a DNA test done on Sandy and myself, then using it as proof of her infidelity. But then I realized that even if I did prove that I was not Sandy's biological father, that fact would also give my wife ammunition in court so as to take Sandy away from me. Instead, I opted to pretend to be ignorant of that fact and hoped that the video of them having played together would be enough. They were on the bed playing again, just like I had seen them the previous time, but now I got everything they did on video. While filming them, I heard Carl tell my wife that he was making sure that his wife would never get her driving permit. That way she couldn't follow him. Later, Rachel told him that I had been acting strangely for the last few days. She also added that she now feared that I might be suspecting the truth about their affair. I could also tell that this revelation was making Carl very nervous. When I figured that I had enough footage of the cheating between her and her lover, I drove home to prepare supper, just like I usually did each time she was working. She usually finishes work at 6 and arrives home 15 minutes later, so I now knew that on those days she was supposed to be working, she and Carl must have been playing from 2:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. While I prepared supper for my soon-to-be broken-up family that same evening, I made up my mind that I was going to make use of that fear they both seemed to have of me. I am not a violent man, but I suppose the story I made up about the man working at the plant who had beaten up his wife because of her cheating did scare the hell out of her. This, and also the fact that I was now using her body like the tool she was probably had a lot to do to contribute to the projection of that image she was now getting of me. I figured she was now biting for time for something to happen which was going to liberate her from me. She was probably looking forward to having me served with divorce papers and thus be free to run to her lover permanently. On Wednesday of the same week that I had filmed her while we were eating supper, I talked to her again about the cuckolded husband from work. I told her that he finally had his revenge against the man who had been playing his wife. I explained to her that the woman's lover was now in the hospital. Of course, he only got what he deserved, I told her. Then, feeding even more the fire of her fear, I added that the cheated husband was filing for divorce as well as for custody of his children. I could tell that Rachel was shocked upon hearing this. As she quietly continued eating, I could see her hands trembling. When she got home from her afternoon of playing the following day, she seemed nervous. I could read fear in her eyes. As we were eating supper, I began to ask her questions about her work, who exactly her boss was, how he looked like, how many children he had, and so on. I had never shown any interest in him before this day, therefore, my inquiring about her boss had the effect of making her feel bad and making me feel good. I even asked her what she did exactly at the pharmacy and how she liked working there. Then, so as to plant still more doubts and add more fuel to her fear, I added that I might stop by and visit her at her place of work one of these days. It was evident now that she was visibly shocked, but she didn't say anything. She just looked at me with a strange expression and slowly nodded. That weekend, I took her out to eat with Sandy. We were acting like a loving family, but even Sandy could tell that her mother had changed in the last couple of weeks. My daughter now always came to me with her questions and hugging, never to her mother. That evening in the restaurant, we were just about done eating when Sandy went to the washroom. Since we were alone, I took the opportunity to ask Rachel if there was something bothering her and if she wanted to talk to me about it. You know, what is the problem? I don't know what has gotten into you in the last couple of weeks, but you are not making love to me any longer. When was the last time that you made love to me? She was now looking at me with deep concern written all over her face. It was clear that in her cheating heart she now felt a spark of remorse, but at the same time it was evident that it was not in her plans to admit anything to me. Even if she had confessed her cheating and begged forgiveness, I certainly wouldn't have forgiven her. It was way too late for that now. What she had done to our marriage, to me, and yes, to Sandy also, was impossible to forgive. You know that I love you, Roger, but for the last couple of weeks I haven't seen love in your eyes when you are with me. You have been hating me, she said. Tell me, Rachel, are you cheating on me? If you are, then we as a couple are over and you will never see our daughter again. I can guarantee you that. I had finally said it. The cat was out of the bag now. She looked at me for long seconds, too stunned to say anything. Even as we both stared at each other, I could see the tears forming in her eyes. All of a sudden, she took her purse and ran out of the restaurant. I paid the bill and waited for Sandy to come out of the washroom. When we got outside to the car, Rachel was standing there waiting for us. Her eyes were red, but she was no longer crying. The next Monday, I went to see my boss and asked for 2 weeks off. He was reluctant at first to give them to me, but when I explained that I had a family crisis, he finally agreed. That same afternoon, I drove to Carl's house. Once I was parked in front of his house, I remained seated for long minutes, thinking about my next move. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I figured that it was time for me to meet his wife and tell her what the score was. I could see her in the backyard near the pool. She seemed taller than Rachel, with light brown hair similar to that of my wife. I finally found the courage to get out of my car, and after opening the door of the fence, I slowly walked into the backyard. As I came closer to her, she was busy moving the chairs around the pool. As soon as I stood in front of her, I introduced myself. I am Roger Weldon. My wife, Rachel, is working for your husband at the pharmacy. She gave me a strange look for a few seconds, then a smile appeared on her lips as she shook my hand. Yes, of course, I have heard of Rachel. I have never met her, but my husband does mention her sometimes. I am Claudine Clarkson. She was smiling at me as we shook hands, and I could tell she had a pleasant personality. I then realized that she knew nothing about her husband's affair with my wife. Of course, what I was about to say to her was going to be devastating, but there was no way around it. She had to learn the truth, so I figured it would be better if I got to the point immediately. After all, I wasn't there for a social visit. Mrs. Clarkson, what I have to tell you will cause you much pain, but you must be told about this. I am afraid that your husband and my wife have been cheating on us, and this has been going on for many years. She remained speechless with her mouth partly open for long seconds as she examined me intensely. When I saw tears starting to form in the corners of her eyes, as she stood there motionless in front of me, she suddenly brought both of her hands over her mouth in shock. But before I could continue with what I had to tell her, she finally asked me if I had proof of what I was saying. Yes, I have proof of their affair. I have pictures of them together in your cottage by the lake, and I am afraid there is much more. After affair has been going on for over 6 years now, and to make matters worse, I am pretty sure that your husband is the biological father of my daughter. All of a sudden, she went into a fit of crying. I had to help her get inside the house. I made her sit on the couch and waited a few minutes until she calmed down a little. As I sat there in front of her, I took out a picture of my daughter from my wallet and handed it to her. This is Sandy, my daughter. Can you see the remarkable resemblance to your husband? Look, she has the same blonde hair, the same slim nose, and high cheekbones. As a matter of fact, she looks a lot like your own daughter. There was a picture of her daughter on the mantel of the fireplace. I got up and took it, placing both pictures next to each other on the coffee table in front of her. Look at the resemblance, Mrs. Clarkson. They could almost pass for twins. We don't have to proceed with DNA tests to see that they are related. Anyone can tell they are sisters. By now, Claudine had stopped crying. She had both pictures in her hands and kept staring at them. Finally, she lifted her eyes toward me and said in a desperate voice, "What are we going to do?" I don't know about you, but I am divorcing my wife, and I want custody of my daughter. Yes, I suppose this is the only fair solution for you. For a long time, I have been having doubts that Carl was cheating on me. After all, I am the one doing the laundry. I will make him pay for what he did. You should get a lawyer, Mrs. Clarkson. If you want, I will give you copies of the pictures. I already have of them together. But we have to wait a couple of days before letting them know that we are aware of their affair. I will explain why. I then went to my car to get the tape, and we watched part of it together. My wife was having an affair with her husband. Claudine cried some more, and then, after a few minutes, she begged me to stop the tape. Once she had calmed down a little, I went on to explain to her what I intended to do. At my request, she finally agreed to wait a few days before letting her husband know that she was leaving him. On Tuesday, I had a talk with my lawyer. He explained to me that even with the pictures of my cheating wife that I had, it would be very difficult for me to get custody of Sandy, especially if I wasn't her biological father. He explained that all my wife had to do was to get a DNA test performed on Sandy and prove that I wasn't her biological father. He also added that if she did bring that argument in court, then I could sue Carl for all those years of child support. But I would still lose custody of Sandy in the process. I certainly didn't want this to happen. Therefore, I told him to stop everything for now. I had to find a way to force her hand into running away from home and leaving Sandy with me. It was thus that I began to formulate a plan to do just that. If I could get her to go away with her lover, even if it was only for a few days, then she would lose her right to obtain custody of our daughter in the eventuality of our separation. After all, there hadn't been any DNA tests performed yet proving I was not Sandy's father, and a mother that went away on a fling with another man would look very bad in the eyes of a judge. When Rachel came home from work, I detected the proof of her cheating. Her lips were slippery and dripping when she realized that I now knew her secret. She began to cry and begged me to forgive her. She tried to talk to me and kept saying how sorry she was, but I just looked at her without saying a word. When she realized that I wouldn't talk to her, she finally told me that she was going to stop her affair with Carl and leave her job. She even claimed that she loved only me, and if I was willing to forgive her, she was going to make it up to me. It was easy to see she was lying after having heard what she had said about me while in the cottage with her lover. I knew she had no intention of leaving him, though she was only trying to gain time. It was clear that she had now made up her mind to leave me for Carl, and the only thing stopping her from leaving immediately was Sandy and her fear of my immediate reaction. I knew that if I wanted to force her to run away with her boss, I had to feed that fear. She had to fear for her safety as well as for that of her lover. Therefore, I told her in a very calm voice that I would never forgive her for cheating on me, and that my vengeance on her and on Carl also was going to be very painful. Of course, I didn't say anything about the fact that I was not Sandy's father. Later that afternoon, I drove to Claudine's house. On my recommendation, she had retained the services of the same lawyer that I had. She told me he had already completed much of the paperwork for both divorces. She also said her husband had been acting strangely during the last 24 hours. She saw him placing boxes in his SUV when he thought she was in the yard. She felt pretty certain that he was secretly planning to leave her. I made her understand that this was the best thing that could happen to her, since she would then get automatic custody of her daughter if he did that. Having his family meant he was going to lose everything. He was going to look very bad in front of a judge if it should come to that. Naturally, Rachel didn't go to work that Tuesday. She said to me that she had quit her job and had no intention of ever talking to Carl again. I didn't give a bird's feather for her promise. For one thing, I knew she was lying, and also, I had no intention of staying married to her much longer. After that day, I noticed that she had discreetly packed things from her walk-in. Therefore, I knew that she was also planning on leaving me very soon, but I had no intention of letting her take Sandy with her. So, to accelerate her already strong desire to run away with her lover, I decided to continue to feed still more fear into her sick mind after noon. I explained to her that I was going to take care of Carl the following week, and she asked me what my intention was regarding our marriage. I simply told her that as soon as I had taken care of her lover, I was going to decide what to do with her. I could see the fear in her eyes as she quietly looked at me for long seconds. I am not a violent man by nature, and before these last 2 weeks, I had always been very gentle with her in bed and during our everyday relationship. But once I discovered she had broken her marriage vows over 6 years ago and was still doing it, the love I once had for her just evaporated, and I became another man, not a violent man, but a sad and angry one. The following day, I drove Sandy to school, and I had a talk with the lady in charge of her school. I explained to her that my wife was planning to run away with another man, and there was a good chance that she was going to try to kidnap my daughter. Under no circumstances was she allowed to let my daughter be removed from school by my wife or anyone else. I explained to her that each day I was going to drive her to school, and then later, I was going to pick her up inside the school where she was to wait for me. As soon as I got back home after leaving Sandy in school, I figured that she was just about ready to leave me. Later in the afternoon, I drove to Claudine's house. I knew that while I was away from home, my wife was going to use the phone and have a talk with Carl, but I was counting on this since I was hoping that they would execute their plan of running away together. I wanted her out of my life, and I wanted him as far away from me as possible. Serving my cheating wife with divorce papers was no longer an option for me. since there was a good chance that she would take Sandy from me in the process. Instead, it was my intention to force her to run away with Carl and thus leave her daughter behind, even if it was only for a few days. It was my intention to move to the other end of the country with my daughter if she did that. Claudine was crying when I got to her house. She said Carl had taken most of his clothing from the house and he took off without telling her where he was going. I now realized that he had been waiting for me to leave my house so that he could get Rachel, but I wanted to make sure that they didn't take Sandy with them, so I immediately drove to Sandy's school. As soon as I got there, I saw Carl's car driving in front of the school. He was with my wife. They both saw me park my car in front of the school, and as soon as they saw me, they drove away very fast. My daughter was still inside the school, and I took her home with me. Later, I explained to Sandy that her mother would be gone for a while since she had to go away to visit a sick relative. The next day, I changed all the locks on the doors, and later, I went to see my lawyer to tell him that Rachel had abandoned her family and run away with her lover. After that, I drove to see a real estate agent so that he could put my house on the market. I explained that I wanted the house sold fast since it was in my name only. I knew that there wouldn't be any problem with the paperwork. That same evening, I phoned Claudine. She was crying. She said her husband had left her a note on her bed, and in it, he explained that he was leaving her because he had fallen in love with someone else. He also explained that the previous week he had talked to his lawyer and the house and cottage were now in her name only. He had also left a small amount of cash in the bank for her. I felt very sorry for her, and somehow I felt a little responsible for what was happening to her. Then I explained to her that my daughter Sandy missed the presence of her mother in the house, and since I was about to order a large pizza and salad, I begged her to bring Kathy and come eat with us. Less than 15 minutes later, Claudine and Kathy were in my house. I think that asking them to come eat with us at our house was the best decision I ever made. You see, my daughter and Kathy got along extremely well together, and Kathy's presence did fill in part the void caused by the absence of her mother. As for me, I found the company of Claudine very revealing and comforting. We all had a very pleasant evening. From there, things developed very fast. Claudine and I soon became very good friends. She sold her cottage and her house, and then she moved in with me. After a couple of weeks, we were now a nice family, and to anyone not knowing us, we were a married couple with 2 beautiful daughters. As soon as I found a buyer for my house, I explained to Claudine that we should move away so that our respective spouses wouldn't be able to find us if they should try to do it. Less than a month after Rachel had left me, I was living in Texas with Claudine and the 2 girls. Over the years, I built a nice house in a medium-sized town, and I discovered that I could make a lot of money as a house contractor. I am now doing just that. I even have 5 men working for me. It now makes 5 years that Claudine and I moved to Texas. We had a baby boy last year, and everyone here believes that we are a happy married couple, and that Sandy and Kathy are our 2 daughters. As for Rachel and Carl, we have never heard from them during all those years, and we are both hoping we never will. I suppose that by now, they must have realized that cheaters always pay the price. After all, they each lost all contact with their respective daughters because of their affair. As we conclude our journey into the world of human relationships, please remember to subscribe, like, and share our content. Thank you for your support, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.